Hey there, guys. All right, today we are back with some more overly sarcastic productions, and this time it is Trope Talk on accents. I think this is going to be a bit like the MacGuffin episode where I'm probably not going to have much to say, because I feel like there really isn't much to say when it comes to accents. But Red here spent 14 minutes talking about accents. Now, of course, I largely kind of just talk about it from a writing perspective, whereas Red kind of mixes it in with television and movies and stuff, not just writing. Um, so yeah. Before we dive in, make sure you go and check out the links in the description box below. I would love it if you join the Discord and follow me over at Twitch. Got nothing else to say here at the beginning. Let's just dive in and see what Red has to say.
This video was sponsored by Campfire. More on that later. Howdy, y'all. Welcome to the video. There comes a moment in every character's development when the writer must ask themselves, what does this character sound like? Maybe I think this guy's gotta sound tough and coarse, like he really means business. Or perhaps they must sound ancient and ethereal, by which I of course mean kinda British. Or maybe you'll just do your best Scottish, even though your only exposure to the accent has been Gimli and Scrooge McDuck. Or maybe you'll just go for the Nick Cage impression and call it a day. A character's character really comes through in their voice. In written media, that's a narrative voice, the tone they're written in. But in media with an audio component, it's a literal voice. While you might think that audio media
Oh, think you're special because you can vibrate the air? Get on my level, bro. Wait, why'd I go with that accent? Get on my level, bro. I can make people imagine they're vibrating air just by saying so. The universe shrilled.
would have a serious advantage in this category, prose can be really good at communicating a distinct narrative voice. The written word is a very impressive thing. But there's some trickiness there right off the bat. See, language is very weird conceptually, and it changes very quickly. Try getting a laugh with what are those these days. So unless the story you're writing is taking
I still laugh at it. Not really. Like, not in an unironic way, I'll laugh at it. No. In an ironic way. In an ironic way, I'll laugh at it, the what are those. But like like I'll laugh at it someone like I laugh at the what are those in Black Panther because I'm like, that is so stupid that that's in a fucking movie because it's gonna date the movie, right? I don't laugh at it because like what are the actual supposed to be joke of what are those, right? You know what I'm saying, right? Like irony, eh, eh.
place in the time and place that matches up with the version of
Totally a righteous quest, my dudes. Yeah, so I'm currently rereading the Ranger's Apprentice series. I finished the first book again. I finished the first book, Ruins of Gorlan. By the time this comes out, it'll have been a couple weeks. And by the time this comes out, I'll probably have also finished the second book, The Burning Bridge. And one thing I'm noticing is the author uses the word totally quite a bit. The characters also grin a lot, which I'm noticing. And I didn't remember any of that from I read them back in middle school, so right, that was like over 10 years ago. 12, 13 years ago. When the fuck was middle school? I can't remember. But characters, even older characters, use the word totally in their language, and it doesn't fit. It really does not fit. Like, I think using it sparingly, like once or twice, it would be fine throughout the whole book. In certain circumstances, but and for those that don't know, The Ranger's Apprentice is a medieval fantasy world series, and totally is, just the way it is used and how often it is used, it clashes because the biggest problem that I'm finding while rereading The Ranger's Apprentice so far is the language, is that there is a mix of the modern language and typical fantasy kind of language. And like when John Flanagan, I think that's the author's name, uses the fantasy, like he's a good writer when it is what you expect of a fantasy language writing style kind of things, he's pretty fucking good at it. But it's also YA, and right, so it's he's got that the modern language in there too. I don't know if that was purposeful or maybe he's just not. Maybe his writing, maybe that's just his writing style where he mixes both. Or maybe his agent or the publishers were like, this is how you got to do it for YA or whatever. Um, or maybe, and this is something that I think I have a problem with sometimes is uh, skill of a writer, right? Where we have to remind ourselves constantly, like, to change up our language, because, right, if I were to write in my natural voice, I think this is going to be the best way to word it. It would come across as modern, right? But I'm writing fantasy. I'm writing medieval fantasy. Um, so, right, you gotta watch out for that. You gotta think like, okay, is this use of this word fitting for the time period? Um, right, like a righteous quest on its own in this context would fit for fantasy, but the addition of totally ruins it, right? Makes it modern, um, as well as obviously my dudes. But yeah. All right, so we're not just when it comes to accents, we are not just talking. I feel like we're not just talking the accent of the character, but we are also talking about the author's voice. I think is something else that Red might be discussing within this video, which if that is the case, then there will be more for me to say.
Of the language you're writing in, there's liable to be some dissonance between the story and the language it's written in. Lots of 60s sci-fi is set in the future, sometimes even the past by now, but it still has some hallmarks of the 60s baked into the language, and it still feels very much of its time. Obviously, the ideal course of action to avoid this kind of dating would be to write in a totally formal and neutral form of the language.
Obvious watermarks of the era can be avoided, but some context will remain. Blood, you starveling, you elf skin, you dried neat's tongue, you bull's pizzle, you stockfish, oh, for breath to utter what is like thee, you tailor's yard, you sheath, you bow case, you vile standing tucked chowderhead.
Language, which, while theoretically free of watermarks of the era, also doesn't work because even the formal textbook stuff changes over time. How many of you are properly using thee and thou these days? There is no
Nope,
such thing
not
as
at all.
dialect-free language. Since slang has a tendency to creep in from social context, language is buried in the social context it's used in, and when a dialect forms, that social context is really baked in. Every form of language has associations, and this is most obvious with accents. Every dialect has at least one accent, and all language is subdivided into dialects. There's no such thing as unaccented speech, just like there's no dialect-free speech. And because accents are rooted in dialects, and dialects are rooted in specific social contexts, accents carry some of that context with them. Now, the thing is, most people don't really think they speak with an accent. Everyone sounds normal to their own ears. There's this false dichotomy between has an accent and doesn't have an accent, and writers fall into this very noticeably if they decide to write a character with a specific accent. For instance, Bram Stoker loved giving his side characters nearly incomprehensible transcribed accents, while his main characters, with the exception of the definitely American Quincy Morris, have no phonetic accent and are generally using dictionary-accurate English. But from the narrative voice, it's still pretty clear what accent it's supposed to be spoken in. Some sentences like, "Here I am, who shall be 20 in September, and yet I never had a proposal till today, not a real proposal, and today I have had 3, just fancy," just don't sound right in my neutral accent, or any accent but posh British. And then there's Quincy, whose lines don't sound right in any accent. "Miss Lucy, I know I ain't good enough to regulate the fixins of your little shoes, but I guess if you wait till you find a man that is, you will go join them 7 young women with the lamps when you quit. Won't you just hitch up alongside of me and let us go down the long road together, driving in double harness?" Ugh. So writers usually write in their own neutral language, which is, of course, a uniquely personal dialect and accent that still registers as normal to them due to familiarity. And when they want to single out a character as outside that normal, well, sometimes they give them an accent they find outside the normal, hoping to carry the associations they have with that accent. Since language is steeped in implication.
Yeah, this is one of the things that is it is hard to do, right? Because especially someone that is a part of the English world, it is very easy. It is one thing that this also plays into is, and this is something that's I've noticed in my writing, and I'm not sure how to fix it, right? You want a diverse world, right? But but you also don't want to be harmful to other, less represented communities, especially with their accents, because that can be that could be, right? People don't want their voice, the way they speak, mocked, right? That's not a good thing to do. And so you don't want to do it wrong. However, as someone part of the English world, right, the English speaking world, who's pretty much only been exposed to English, when it comes to writing different dialects, I find it extremely easier to write like a Scottish or Irish person and make that come across in the way that they speak without blatantly stating the characters speaking at a different dialect. They have a different accent, right? It comes across in just the way I write their dialogue, right? However, because I don't have the experience being around uh, people from, like, let's go with Africa as an example, because I don't have the experience of being around them and the way they speak, they also end up getting written with the same kind of dialect as my personal voice, right? Even though they are supposed to in world they have what would be a in our world relative relation. In our world it would be like a West African accent or something like that. I don't know how to fucking write it. I don't know how to change up uh the words there because I don't have the experience with how they speak, right? Like that's one thing that is actually, I think, that can go with this. Is like, if you don't have the experience with people from that part of the world with that accent, you're not going to be able to write it in the dialogue and make it clear. And then, of course, that raises the question, like, well, if you can't do it to all dialects, should you do it to any dialects, right? Like, if you can't do it to all of them, then do you leave out the the dialogue changes and just have everyone speak, essentially have everyone's dialogue read the same, but in the narration have it say speaking in like their dialect or whatever, their accent coming through, right? Do you blatantly state it in the narration, or for the ones that you are uh, exposed enough to write in the dialogue, do you write them in the dialogue and then just have the ones you're not experienced to just be, as I said, just stated in the narration, where it's like their accent's slightly different. Perhaps you go and look up other ways of describing it online, like how to describe, I don't know, a West African accent or whatever, right? Um, so yeah, that's the best way I can I can think of it. Uh, and then of course one other way that you can turn this on its head is, but it's a lot of effort and I haven't done it yet. Is, right, you write a POV of a character through uh their of someone from one of the foreign cultures in your world, and then to them, then, right, the readers will then see that character, the uh the characters that have what would be considered the author's voice, are the wacky foreigners, if we want to say that word, say it that way. And so try and then get it across that way that, like, yeah, now they're the ones with the accents, right? It's just it gets complicated real quick.
This is one of the most efficient ways to get across some structural character traits. In theory. In practice, because language is so steeped in implications, this can be a bit like trying to paint on a little bit of smoky eye and accidentally dropping the entire housewares section on someone. Of course, sometimes characters just get given accents because they're fun. It's not always that deep.
Yeah.
In cases when that's true, it's just as casual as any other character trait. We made this character have this accent because they're from this place or because it's fun, and that's as far as that goes. But while sometimes an accent is just an accent, sometimes it's meant to signal more than that. And that's where things start getting complicated. But before we dive into
Yep.
accents and how they're used in fiction, specifically accents of English, we have to address why this story is written in English at all. Many stories take place in settings that aren't specifically the English-speaking regions of modern-day Earth. In fact, they may have very little to do with Earth at all. And English is a serious hot mess of a language, with its linguistic development
Yeah.
rooted in a lot of goofy and highly specific historical shenanigans. How do we justify its presence in a story or world that doesn't line up with the version of the language we're using? Now, the realistic or Doyleist explanation is that the story is written in modern English because it's being written by a writer who's fluent in it and intended for an audience who's also fluent in it. And as narratively
Yeah.
accurate as it might be to write the whole thing in your own personal conlang, the goal of a story is to be read, so you probably want to make it readable. Finnegan's Wake is
Yeah.
purposely written in not contemporary English, and it's notorious for being nigh incomprehensible. But like all Doyleist explanations, this requires a little suspension of disbelief, and since we're asking the question, we're clearly not suspending our disbelief. Specifically, we are harpooning our disbelief out of the sky for the purposes of narrative analysis. So let's look at the in-universe or Watsonian explanation. Now, this explanation can vary a lot. Sometimes it's just not addressed, which is fine most of the time. Like I said, suspension of disbelief.
I always go with the story itself is translated, or no. I'm sure she's about to talk about this. And I kind of alluded to it in how I was speaking earlier when it comes to accents, right? And it's what Tolkien did for certain. That's how he justified certain languages, especially that of the Rohirrim, of Rohan. Rohan, those people are based on the Anglo-Saxons. So Tolkien, he created I think a Rohirrim language, but he hadn't finished it or whatever. And so his explanation as to why they have essentially just Anglo-Saxon names is because, well, they are the equivalent of their language to our historical languages are Anglo-Saxon, and so I'll just translate them to Anglo-Saxon. That was his justification for the Anglo-Saxon names of the Rohirrim, of Rohan. And that's largely also, that's the way I look at it, right? When I give names to places, right? The Southron Kingdom in my world, the lower half of the island of Delroth, heavily based on, largely inspired by Gaelic kind of stuff, Welsh, Britain, Gaelic Scottish, Gaelic Irish, that kind of sort of thing. So their names, their first names, last names, I just use Gaelic names. I just go on Google and essentially look up Gaelic names and see which ones I just pick which ones I like the most, which sound the nicest to me in my biased brain, and I go with those for the character names. Ones that I also feel like are easily read by my English brain. Ones I know how to pronounce are largely the ones I pick. So yeah, right, and then the main location that's kind of the most explored, the northern half of the island of Delroth is, they have more essentially just British sort of names, but there are also a couple spots of like Anglo-Saxon names in it, right? So yeah, but I'm also able to play around more with those names, and I change them up a bit more because, well, I want to. It's fantasy; I can do what I want, and also because I know the language, right? I am a natural English speaker. I'm a natural English speaker. Fuck. I can mess around with the language easier and not, do harm, right? Whereas if I were to try and mess around perhaps with the accents, the names of like West African names or Asian names or Gaelic names, I don't know the language well enough to confidently mess with those names. And essentially that's kind of what Tolkien does, where he's like, language not either like his translation, his justification, like I have not translated the Rohirrim language enough, or the Rohirrim language wasn't complete enough to translate it, and so I'm just going to use Anglo-Saxon as a stand-in because they are very their most equivalent to our world is the Anglo-Saxon English, uh, and that's essentially my justification, right? I am in world the Southrun people of Delroth are out of universe explanation. They are based on the Gaelic people. I'm just going to use the Gaelic names. In universe explanation, is their names are probably different, slightly changed, but their closest relation to our world, and to get that across best and easiest is just using the Gaelic names, right? Um, and that's largely where I think this comes in, or well, that's kind of my writing philosophy is you want, and also this also comes across as a means of your best chance at being able to have writing be viable as a career is you do need to do things even though maybe you don't necessarily want to, because they are things that will get the point across the simplest and the easiest, right? Just having characters with Gaelic names do multiple things within the story that I want to get across, right? Especially if those that know English history. The Gaelic name gets across, all right, they are of a different culture, right? They are a different culture than that of the main characters, the main character, and um, a different culture, so different beliefs, right? That gets that across. If you know history and you know the way in which the English treated Gaelic people, that gets another point across, which is a part of the world, which is the imperialism and conquest part of my world. That tells you, insinuates another thing within the text that, right, there is a power dynamic here, uh, that is relative to what happened historically in our world, right? So that Gaelic name gets, I think, helps get that across. It gets the point across simplest, and that's a lot of the time. That's just what you got to go with. That's what makes your story. A lot of the time, just going the simplest way to get the point across can be the best, right? Because in your story, and especially the stories I want to tell, there are other things that are going to be much more complex and deep. And so, like, making the accents and names deep or whatever may do harm to the story that I'm trying to tell, right? Because if I'm just not like going simple, like our world equivalent, that could, overcomplicate things and cause people's attention to drift elsewhere, drift away from what I want them to actually focus on. I hope that makes sense. I feel like it does.
Totally fair to handwave the language you're writing in, because what else can you be reasonably expected to do? Then some stories write in stuff like universal translators, especially popular in sci-fi narratives, though there's still no explanation as to why the version of English the translators default to is the same one that was popular when the story was made. And then, as always, there's Tolkien setting the high bar of insanity with the ultimate explanation for why his fantasy epics are written in English, specifically that he translated them into English. In the meta-narrative around The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, Tolkien claims that he's drawing on a primary source called the Red Book of Westmarch, specifically several annotated and edited copies of the original manuscript, which was written by Bilbo but lost to history. He's basically deriving this from the Norse Eddas, where the originals are also not available. This original story would have been written in one of the many conlangs Tolkien created for this world, and The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings were just translations and compilations from this original source text. The names aren't even the same. Like Merry, full name Meriadoc, who was supposedly originally named Chilimanzar, which was shortened to Chilik, which meant happy or merry. So in the process of translating, quote-unquote, Tolkien renamed him Meriadoc duck, which could be shortened directly to Mary. This is the high bar explanation for why the story is in English when the original has no reason to be, and it's also a convenient segue into an extremely relevant topic: localization. Localization is a term that'll be painfully familiar to anime fans. It describes the process by which a story is translated, rewritten, and adapted to appeal to a specific regional audience. It essentially attempts to recontextualize the story so that this new audience can appreciate it in the same way its original audience would have appreciated it, mapping unfamiliar context from the original into a more familiar parallel, attempting to reproduce the original vibe which was lost when the story was removed from its source context. Kinda like those early 2000s reimaginings of Shakespeare plays into modern settings. Tolkien renames his characters Merry and Pippin because to his audience of mid-1900s England, those names would have sounded cheerful and homey to match the characters, where the original names of Chillick and Razal would sound weird and alien. Of
Yeah.
course, since he was making up the original story and localizing kinda backwards, this is a dubious example. Unlike the case of Lysistrata, a comedic play written by Aristophanes in the 400s BC, wherein the women of Athens and Sparta worked together to end the Peloponnesian War by refusing to bone the men until they cut it out. I read a translation of it in high school and noticed something very weird about the Spartan character Lampedo. She was written with a very noticeable Scottish accent. Recognizing that this play had been written in ancient Greek, I asked my teacher where the heck that accent had come from, and she told me that the author of our translation was British. The logic had basically been that to the Athenian audience, the Spartans were crude, violent brawlers, so Sparta was to Athens as Scotland was to England. Basically, it's a big ol' stereotype.
Yeah, and that's where the accent part gets problematic. When you look at it, when you use the justification, like it also depends on the intent. This is one of those times where, right, where we got to talk about the intent of the author. And a lot of the time when it comes to, like, the intent of this author here, right, was, well, we don't learn. I think it's fairly safe to assume because it's a British person of, like, what, the 1800s was when it was written. Is that what they said? What Red said? We can largely assume that, right, this is a negative intention on the authorial part. When it comes to accents and stereotyping and things like that, you don't want to do that. You don't want to make your barbarian character in your story, have a Scottish or Irish accent because, well, they're a barbarian character, right? That's not the reason why they should be given that accent. The characters, the Southron characters in my world, are given their Gaelic accents because, well, that is the culture that I am pulling from. I'm not using the Gaelic accents because of course I want to also draw parallels to our real world. Fantasy is full of that, of drawing parallels to our real world. It is typically used as a safe space to criticize our world. That is what fantasy, sci-fi is pretty much all about. A safe space and a place to criticize our world through a fantastical lens. And so, right, so of course there's the drawings of British English imperialism and conquest of the Irish and Scottish and Welsh. But also, like, I'm drawing from the Gaelic culture. I'm not doing it because they are a barbaric people. I'm doing it because that's the culture I'm drawing from. I feel like it would be worse of me as the author to then give them the same accent as, like, the English, somewhat English inspired culture people, right? That'd be a bit, not cool, right? I'm drawing from the specific culture. I'm going to represent that culture. That includes their accent, Now, of course, then we also got to bring up the fact, like, well, am I able to do that with all other accents and cultures present in the world? Am I able to, when a character meets someone from a culture that is inspired by the Mandinka people of West Africa, sub-Saharan West Africa, the Mali Empire kind of inspired place that I have in my world. I don't know the accent well enough to be able to play with it within the written dialogue. So, right, so we get back into the question that I brought up earlier, like, if I can't do it for all accents, should I do it for any of them then, right? If I can't do it for all, do I then just go basic and authorial voice, authorial accent for all, and then just mention it in the narration, in the tags, speaker tags, person has a slight accent or whatever, and describe the accent a bit in an authorial tag. That's one question I constantly find myself debating, and it's something that perhaps that I think ultimately requires sensitivity readers from those places of the world, right?
Stereotype full of ethnic humor.
Huh.
Isn't that fun? It's not just England, by the way, since the English perception of Scotland isn't the same as, say, the American perception of Scotland or the Scottish perception of Scotland. Other translations localize with different accents to carry the same implications. For instance, American translations of Lysistrata often suggest an Appalachian accent for Lempido. So the translator for Lysistrata localized the play to an English audience by telling them these Spartans were basically Scots. And they weren't the only ones. Thanks to Gerard Butler's dulcet tones, the Spartans in 300 also sound Scottish, except for the Queen. She gets to sound English. In fact, English seems to be the official accent of all of human history, since everyone from Roman emperors to French revolutionaries will be inexplicably extremely British. Les Mis has this bad. We show that the students at the barricades are classy because of their mild BBC English accents, and then we show that Gavroche is a low-class gutter snipe by giving him a Cockney accent. In France, lest we forget. The use of accents in fiction is often a
Yeah, it's weird. Like, Les Mis, like, it's one of those things. It's like, well, you want the story to be told in English, right? Because that's, I mean, ultimately, that's also where the money is going to be, right? You're making a movie for the most amount of people, and as of things stand right now, America brings in the most, is the one area in the world that brings the single, like, is it makes purchases of like the most movie tickets or whatever. And then China's creeping up. But you gotta, honestly, to appeal to the Chinese audience, you kind of have to make a movie targeting China, really, which of course then sometimes doesn't do as well in the United States or in Europe, right? So you gotta essentially pick or choose. Um, Although I think the Marvel movies do really well in China, so Marvel might have found a way in. But anyways, um, but like, movies like Gladiator, where it would be a Roman accent or things like that. Um, I'm gonna be honest, I don't know if I want to be hearing a thick Italian accent speaking English. Like that can also end up pulling you out of it, because here's the thing, you're hearing the Italian accent, but they're not speaking Italian, right? They're speaking English. And so in this case, right, when we look at it that way, movies like Gladiator, I don't mind uh, them speaking in what we consider to be a, you know, imperial accent, I guess is one way to put it. Um, I don't mind that. Uh, because I feel like hearing, an Italian accent speaking English in a movie, set around Italian history would comes across pulls me more out of the story than hearing a British accent speaking English set in Italian history, right? Like that second one doesn't pull me out as much, right? Um, if you're like, obviously, if you're gonna do it the best way to do it to tell those kind of stories, right? The sheer best way, the most authentic way, right, would be, you know, speaking Latin in a Latin accent. That's not fucking possible. That's not gonna happen. Right? That then becomes very niche. Right? And so we get back into that discussion of balancing, like, how do we want to do this? And yeah, it's accents in movies they don't tend to bother me for the most part. Um, Especially when it comes to historical movies, as long as I can like understand them and it's not like throwing off the vibe, right? Like if a Roman Empire emperor were to speak with an Australian accent, that would throw me off. But if they speak in like a posh, or what I considered a posh British accent, that is not glaring to me because my American brain, kind of assumes the British accent as that, think of themselves as superior fucking shit, I also wouldn't mind a Roman emperor speaking in an American accent. That wouldn't throw me off because of, well, America's stance in the global world at this point in time, right? At the point in time that we live in, right? It does do things subconsciously that we may not think about, and we may want to say, no, that doesn't exist, but it subconsciously does, right? The British and American accents in especially when applied to stories involving empires, those accents work, and why no one tends to have too many problems with them, aside from, of course, Italians may not like Gladiator because it's a story about Rome, and Romans are Italians from the Italian peninsula. They may not like that for those reasons, which totally justifiable. I don't want to come across as saying that those, points are not justified. Those opinions are totally justified. But for me, as an English speaker, from the American audience, and also as a storyteller myself who is somewhat aware of, you gotta sell tickets, right? The British accent for a Roman emperor or a Roman general essentially fills the same purpose as what an Italian accent would do. Because, right, the Italian accent would be perhaps the more historical one, but what the British accent does, while not being historical, does also get the point across, right? And this goes back to what I was talking about earlier, simply getting your point across. The British accent gets the point across of them being a bit uptight, right? We kind of get to assume that a character is a bit more uptight, when they have a British accent. But it also gets the point across of them being an empire, right? Because in our modern mind, when we think of empire, we think of British Empire. Now, some will also think of French Empire, which is like if you're telling a Napoleon story and there's, right, I don't understand why. That one I do agree with Reddit. It's a little weird that if you're telling a French story and they're not speaking, like, even though they may be speaking English, the French accent would still get the point across just fine. It's when we go super far back, right? That like Roman history, right? Where the accent thing doesn't bother me too much. But like if we were telling a story of Italian unification and they were speaking British English with British accents, that would not come across right to me. Whereas if they were speaking English but with Italian accents, that would fit better because, it's the 1800s. Huh. My God. I don't. How long was that rant?
Tool to
Like,
localize a narrative
I'm
by
done
leveraging
talking.
local stereotypes to map to less familiar stereotypes. We might not be able to recognize a low-class French accent, so when we translate it into English, we use Cockney as the code instead. Though of course, we Americans only recognize Cockney as the stereotypical low-class accent because it gets used that way so much. It's pretty circular. And accents don't always have to be linked with ethnic stereotypes. Consider talking like a pirate when you gotta get across that you're pirates, for instance. That accent has the distinction of being almost completely made up, too, which I guess just proves that you don't need to leverage existing stereotypes when when building your fictional demographics. Anyway, classical literature aside, localization was also a serious concern in the earlier days of anime dubbing. This might sound weird in the post-simuldub world we live in, where anime has infiltrated every level of our society, but back in the day, the idea that Americans might enjoy Japanese television was extremely controversial. At minimum, it was kind of untested, so when dubbing companies started trying to dub anime for a mainstream American audience, sometimes they made some pretty significant changes to make it more palatable. The dubbing company 4Kids was kind of notorious for this. When they dubbed Pokemon, for instance, they would systematically scrape out any and all references to Japanese culture, including the food. Rice balls would be crudely photoshopped out and replaced with things like crackers or sub sandwiches. They'd also rename characters, which was more notable in how they dubbed Yu-Gi-Oh! Japanese names like Jonochi Katsuya, Anzu, and Honda became Joey Wheeler, Taya, and Tristan. And this is also where they really went ham on the accents. Those of you who watch the dub or are otherwise familiar with Yu-Gi-Oh! The Abridged series will know that Joey has an extremely noticeable Brooklyn accent, and Bakura has a British accent. Neither of these make all that much sense in context. Everyone seems to have kind of grown up in roughly the same neighborhood, but the accents are there anyway. This is because in the original Japanese, both characters had fairly distinct styles of speech, styles that don't translate into English very easily. Japanese has some very specific modes of formality in speech, ranging from a very informal mode used when talking to close friends or family, up to a very formal mode that can sound almost archaic in daily use. Joey, or Jonochi, notably uses the absolute least formal speech no matter who he's talking to, because he's a pretty brash, rude guy without an ounce of respect for authority. It doesn't really matter to him if he's talking to his best friend or a bazillionaire CEO, he'll be casual just the same. And in contrast, Bakura speaks extremely formally. Most of his lines could come out of a textbook, no slang, informality, or abbreviation anywhere. This doesn't apply to his evil alter ego, by the way. Kid's just polite. So when localizing, the translators gave Joey a thick Brooklyn accent and Bakura a British accent to clue the audience in that Joey was loud and rude and that Bakura was formal and polite. And while it wasn't strictly an accent, when translating for Yugi and Yami, they had to deal with the fact that Yugi describes himself with the personal pronoun boku, which just means I, but has implications of youth or immaturity, while Yami uses ore, which also just means I, but has implications of masculinity, maturity, and superiority. So while the original Japanese version just had Yami kind of sounding a little more confident than Yugi, the dub also made Yami sound considerably older with a much deeper voice. What's interesting is that their localization efforts actually kind of flattened one of the characters. The villain, Pegasus, was an American in the original Japanese version, and he talked really weirdly. He would use English words in place of Japanese words almost at random, and he handled honorifics really bizarrely. Japanese appends honorifics to names. You don't just call someone by their name, you append something like kun or san or sama or chan. They mean stuff like Mr. or Miss or Lord, or imply diminutives like kid. Pegasus would append boy, like the English word boy in place of kun, which kind of means boy, but you would never use them interchangeably. And he still does this in the English dub, calling people like Kaiba boy and stuff. But while it's still pretty weird, it loses the context.
Oh yeah, is he the one that goes like a Yugi boy?
How staggeringly bizarre he sounded in the original Japanese. He was like the inverse of that person who sprinkles random Japanese
Yes, he is Yugi boy.
into their English because they've gotten way into anime and they think that's sufficient to learn a language. To properly localize it, he probably should have been saying stuff like, "Konnichiwa, everybody! I'd like to welcome you to my Simply Sugoi tournament." So specifically giving a character an accent is usually meant to code to the audience that this character is intended to carry associations of that accent, whereas not giving a character an explicit accent leaves it implied to be neutral, though as we've discussed, there still is an accent present, just one considered neutral by the author. Bram Stoker's non-Quincy, non-Van Helsing main characters still sound strange when read in a non-English accent because the accent is connected with the dialect, and the dialect the book uses is fairly standard highbrow English. But because those characters speak in a similar dialect to the one used in the narration, it comes across as a neutral accent. We're not supposed to infer anything about those characters from their speech patterns, unlike the goofy foreign Dr. Van Helsing or the bold American cowboy Quincy Morris. Now, like all coding, this is very tricky to do, and it's easy to accidentally communicate associations you don't mean.
Yep.
It can also be hard to distinguish traits of the character from traits of the stereotype you're coding them with.
Yep.
Tolkien's elves may have talked kinda posh British in the movie, but derivative elves in other works often also act posh British, where the originals were just very ancient and alien. And how many traits of modern fantasy dwarves borrow from Tolkien's complex originals instead of just dipping into the well of Scottish stereotypes that got attached by the movie? When you're coding a character, you have less control than you might want over how the audience reads the character. The other difficulty, of course, is that because language changes surprisingly quickly, the coding can also change out from under you. Stoker's use of transcribed phonetic accents probably carried a lot of associations at the time, but nowadays they're nearly incomprehensible. It's hard enough to understand what the characters were even saying, let alone what stereotypes we're supposed to be assigning them. The problem with localizing or coding for an audience is it only works on that specific audience, and as time and society marches on, the coding loses some of the context that made it work in the first place. Let's see. Sometimes an accent is just an accent, but sometimes it's a lot more than that, and sometimes that can be a problem. Language is weird, writing is hard, accents are deceptively hard, and if you think you're good at one, you're probably wrong. So, yeah. And thanks again to Campfire for sponsoring.
Yeah, I still don't know whether, like, I think in the first, in the book that I'm currently trying to get published, the one that I tried to get the Kickstarter for, and the one that I put up the first 5 chapters for, there aren't accents in there, because it's all a very localized place. I think I might just take out dialogue accent, and just have everyone kind of speaking this. I don't know. I don't know what to do. I don't know. But that was Trope Talk Accents by Overly Sarcastic Productions. This ended up being way fucking longer than I thought it would. I thought I would get this in 20 minutes. This is 46 minutes. I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.